how is operational planning integrated with deception planning? We'll look at Op Bertram, the deception plan for the Second Battle of El Alamein. Ladies and gentlemen, we're continuing our look at tactical, operational and strategic deception as a part of the planning for the Second Battle of El Alamein. As we often do with the Principles of War podcast, we're taking the indirect approach to our final objective, which is a checklist for deception planning and integrating that into the operation. This is the second part of our series on deception planning. We finished up last week with the 2nd 24th Australian Battalion, part of 9th Division. They've just taken Tel El Isa. They've captured Unit 621, one of the jewels of the crown of Rommel's Desert Afrika Korps. And we're in the process of exploiting the intelligence material that has been harvested. Last week we discussed a lot of the tactical value that came from the capture of Unit 621. Today we're going to be looking at operational and strategic. The first component that the Allies found in their haul was confirmation that the Black Code had been compromised. This was the code used by Colonel Fellers, who was the US military attaché in Cairo. He used this to transmit his information back to Washington, and he was given carte blanche access to the Allied headquarters. So he had a full understanding of the Allied dispositions and intentions, and he was transmitting that back to Washington. In 1941, Italian military intelligence, which was actually quite a capable body, had stolen the code from the American embassy in Rome. And since then, they'd been able to read everything that was transmitted using that encryption. The next example is really interesting. Two of the German signalers each had copies of Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. Now, I've never read the book. It must be pretty good, though. It was written in 1938, and it hasn't been out of print since then, and it sold over 2.8 million copies. However, the German signalers couldn't speak English, so that's a little bit unusual. This was a book that was being used by the signalers for encoding and decoding messages to two spies who were in Cairo. They were working with Anwar Sadat, who would become the future president of Egypt. These spies had been driven to Egypt by Laszlo Almasi. He was a Hungarian working for the Abwehr. His exploits would become part of the Academy Award-winning movie The English Patient. Now, these two spies, it was known that they were in Cairo, and in fact, Bletchley Park had broken their code, and they'd sent a warning of Almasi's mission to insert the two spies into Cairo, but it was late being decrypted because of the flap that had occurred with the German advance to El Alamein. The two spies were living on a houseboat in the middle of Cairo. They were tracked down and their houseboat raided at 2 o'clock on the morning on the 25th of July. On the houseboat was found a matching copy of Rebecca. These spies were codenamed Condor, and they'd been transmitting information to Rommel's headquarters about the conditions in Cairo at the time. The copy of Rebecca that they had was found with an already encoded message. The next step was something that I think the British had a real flair for in World War II, and that was to continue using the radio to transmit information. This time it would be British information and it would be going directly to Rommel. They transmitted a message about British fears of a German attack on the ridge at Alam Halfa. This ridge was actually heavily defended and actually where the Allies wanted the Germans to attack. This is one piece of information that would have gone to Rommel's headquarters. In the past, Allied deception measures had met with limited success because of the fact that so much of the British traffic was being read by the Germans. There were now significantly less sources for the German intelligence section to put together the piece of the enemy picture. This increased the value of the limited sources that they had. The Allies played on this by synchronising various sources with the same message to reinforce each message. Brigadier Freddie de Guingand, who on the arrival of Montgomery was appointed as his chief of staff, conducted an operation to reinforce the message that had been sent by Condor. He was to use the classic haversack ruse. De Guingand was to write later, "We always produced going maps, which were layered in colours to show the type of desert insofar as it affected movement. We knew the enemy had captured many of our maps and was making use of them. At the time of our retreat to Alamein, no going maps existed in the area to the rear of our positions. These we produced after we settled in." De Guingand knew about the mapping procedure. He knew from interrogation reports that the Germans were using British maps, and knowing Rommel, it was highly likely that he was about to attack. And he then writes, "I therefore decided to have a false going map which would link up quite correctly with the maps already in enemy hands and then falsify a particular area to suit our plans. The area I selected, in consultation with our intelligence staff, was one south of Alam Halfa. Due south from the high point, Hill 132 on Alam Halfa Ridge, was an area of very soft sand. As we appreciated, the enemy would make for this ridge. I thought by showing this bad area as good going, the enemy would be tempted to send his tanks around that way. It would also give him a shock if he were going for El Haman, for instead of a good gallop, he would find himself wallowing in deep sand." We had this map secretly printed in very quick time by the energy of an old associate of mine in the Military Intelligence Directorate in Cairo, Stuart Menteith. Then we plotted with 13th Corps to have it captured by the enemy. In the south, light forces were continually patrolling around enemy minefields, and so it was arranged that a scout car would be blown up on a mine and that the crew should be taken off in another truck. Left out in the scout car were soldiers' kits and the usual junk, but stuffed away in a haversack was an old and dirty going map, the fake, covered in tea stains but quite readable. So that night, a German patrol was sent out. It ransacked the car, took the map, and that map was closely examined in Rommel's headquarters. Because it largely conformed with the information that they already had, they assessed it as being genuine. Rommel's assault did not go to plan. The assault force was held up by far too long by the strong and, as previously unsuspected, mine barriers. There was 150,000 mines, and the elements of surprise, which had formed the basis for the whole plan, had been lost. Rommel continues, "With the British armour now assembled for immediate action, it was impossible for us to continue with our wide sweep to the east, as our flanks would have been under a constant threat. This compelled us to decide on an earlier turn to the north than we had intended. The objective for the attack was now set as Hill 132 for the Afrika Korps." The assault failed, and prisoner interrogation showed that the Germans had used the falsified map to select their route and had been led onto the soft going, and that had tripled their fuel consumption. De Guingand learned via ultra intercepts that Rommel blamed fuel shortages for the failure of the assault. This is an excellent example of a coordinated deception plan at the tactical level. The Condor spy message, along with the false going map, drives Rommel right into the guns of the strong defensive position that Montgomery has prepared for him. Montgomery, in many respects, was bearing the fruit of other men's labours, and one of those people was Lieutenant General Wavell. He had put in significant effort to build up the deception capabilities of the 8th Army. Whaley, in his book, writes that the British, during World War I, had built up a significant capability in deception. However, by World War II, all of that capability had been lost, and the only bridge to it was Wavell. Wavell, during World War I, had worked with T.E. Lawrence and with Allenby. He'd participated in the Megiddo campaign, which was brilliantly deceptive. And he came to believe that surprise was caused by mobility or deception. He wrote a paper in 1942 entitled Ruses and Stratagems of War, and in that he wrote, "Perhaps the most elementary principle of all deception is to attract the enemy's attention to which you wish him to see and distract his attention from that which you do not wish him to see. It is by these methods that the skillful conjurer obtains his results." In 1939, as a Lieutenant General, he was appointed the commander of Middle East Command. And it was during Operation Compass, where he was outnumbered 2.5 to 1 in combat troops, 1.5 to 1 in tanks, and 19 to 1 in artillery, that his Western Desert Force was able to achieve complete strategic and tactical surprise of intent, time, and place for his Operation Compass. He was eventually packed off to take over as Commander-in-Chief in India, but it was Rommel who wrote, when describing the British generals, that the only one to show a touch of genius was Wavell. In June 1940, Wavell had found himself overburdened by not only being the operational planner, but also the deception planner for his operations. So he summoned Colonel Dudley Clarke out to Cairo to assist him. Clarke arrived in Cairo on December the 18th, 1940, and he set about developing a senior staff for deception planning. Clarke assembled a hand-picked selection of officers known for their creativity and innovative approaches to problem-solving. Clarke was the first British officer to run a double agent, and he also devised the concept of dummy orbats, fictitious units, divisions, even entire armies that would feed into the enemy intelligence picture, projecting strength where there was none, and creating ambiguity into the likely intentions of the Allies. The development of a deception capability is quite difficult, and a lot of it comes from experience. Clarke wrote about one of the most important lessons he learnt early on. In the first deception plan I ever tackled, I learned a lesson of inestimable value. The scene was Abyssinia. General Wavell wanted the Italians to think he was about to attack them from the south in order to draw off forces from those opposing him on the northern flank. The deception went well enough, but the result was just the opposite of what Wavell wanted. The Italians drew back in the south and sent what they could spare from there to reinforce the north, which was, of course, the true British objective. After that, it became a creed within a force to ask a general, what do you want the enemy to do, and never what do you want him to think? Clarke went on to write that it was surprising how difficult they often found it to produce an answer. Fortunately, the least deception-conscious general in the Middle East was Montgomery, but he was the best at answering it. By 1944, A Force had grown to 41 officers, 76 NCOs, and 3 company-sized operational units. They were capable of running strategic and tactical deception planning and operations, camouflage and double agents in the Mediterranean theatre through Cairo headquarters and 4 mobile field headquarters. I think this is a really important point about the amount of assets that need to be allocated to create a deception capability. And it was Wavell all the way back in 1940 who had planted the seed for a tree that was now about to bear fruit for Montgomery after he took over command of 8th Army. So we're now at the deception plan for 2nd Alamein. Both sides find themselves in a situation that is not dissimilar to the First World War. It's a narrow stretch of land, the Mediterranean on one side, the Qattara Depression on the other. A large number of mines, a large amount of barbed wire, and significant defensive positions that needed to be assaulted. Freddie de Guingand briefed Dudley Clarke as such. Well, there it is. You must conceal 150,000 men with 1,000 guns and 1,000 tanks on a plain as flat and hard as a billiard table, and the Germans must know anything about it, although they'll be watching every moment, listening for every noise, charting every track. You can't do it, of course, but you bloody well got to. They were the instructions for the deception plan for Operation Lightfoot. This was Montgomery's assault for 2nd Alamein. A Force's plan was to deceive as to the location, time and intent of Op Lightfoot. To do so, Clarke came up with 2 operations, Operation Treatment, which is the strategic deception plan, and Operation Bertram, which is the tactical deception plan. Treatment was to put out the message that there was going to be no major offensive in the Western Desert at all. The threat from the Caucasus was too severe to permit the Allies to conduct offensive operations in the desert. A minor offence was to occur, and it was the intent of that offence was for Montgomery to develop his troops under operational conditions and to improve his tactical positions. The major offensive was still directed at Crete. A conference was planned for the 26th of October, and this would include the Commanders-in-Chief of Middle East, Persia, Iraq and India commands. That was going to be Alexander, Tedder, Maitland, Wilson and Wavell. Preparations were made for their travel and accommodation. These preparations were only cancelled after Op Lightfoot was well underway. Not only that, but the last week in October was scheduled as a leave period for the 8th Army. Rooms were booked in Cairo hotels, and units were encouraged to conduct sporting engagements and social activities during this period. Clarke used his Cheese network, which was a network of fictitious spies, to feed information into the Abwehr. A series of other coordinated activities also occurred. Dummy landing craft were assembled in Cypriot harbours, dummy gliders were assembled at Egyptian airfields, and Greek forces were put on standby. Rumours were also promulgated throughout the Greek exile community. This actually had some impact, with Hitler ordering on the 23rd of September that the garrison within Crete needed to be reinforced, and he repeated that order on the 21st of October. During the planning for Op Treatment and Op Bertram, Clarke was called away to the United States to support the planning for Operation Torch. These were the amphibious operations to be conducted in North Africa. This would be conducted from the 8th to the 16th of November and would occur 3,500 kilometres to the east. There was a UK force sailing 2,700 miles, and the US force would sail 4,500 miles. Now, the big risk for Torch was U-boats. In June in 1942 saw 700,000 tonnes of shipping sunk by U-boats. So a deception plan for Torch was a prerequisite for a successful landing. 2nd El Alamein would benefit from that strategic plan. That deception plan had the strategic intent of denying the Germans knowledge that there was no landing planned in northwestern Europe for 1942. If they didn't know that there wasn't going to be a landing, they would hold troops in that European sector. And they didn't want any reinforcements going to the Middle East or to Russia. They also needed to deny the U-boats the ability to interdict those convoys with their most precious cargo. So that's Op Treatment, the strategic deception plan for Operation Lightfoot. Let's have a look at the tactical plan. This is an incredibly intricate plan because the Germans were going to be able to see most of the movement that occurred. And Clarke believed that the lie, which is the cover plan, was so precious that it should be flanked with an escort of truths. So Operation Lightfoot, and the name Lightfoot was a joke reference to the infantry who would have to move through the Devil's Gardens of mines. So the plan for Lightfoot was 30th Corps under Lee's would be the main effort in the north. It would breach the minefields and engage the main defensive lines, then conduct an attritional battle, crumbling the defences. The main effort weighted with a significant amount of artillery to enable the infantry to achieve their objectives. 10th Corps under Lumsden would conduct a passage of lines. This is the Armoured Corps. They would establish defensive positions and then destroy the Afrika Korps as they attempted to counterattack. Montgomery was still not confident in his armour, particularly in the offensive. And remembering that they'd fought from static positions that had been dug in the Battle of Alam Halfa. 13th Corps, which is to the south, would conduct a demonstration. They would deceive the Afrika Korps as to what the main effort was to be, and they would deny them the ability to release their reserves at the correct time. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Richardson, who was the chief planner in 8th Army Deception, described Lightfoot as terribly obvious. The main effort would see significant massing, and so the problem was how to hide this, how to hide the artillery, how to hide all of the supplies. Early reconnaissance detection of that build-up would signal the main effort, and this would, at best, significantly increase battle casualties, and at worst, it would see Lightfoot fail. The objectives for Op Bertram were, first, to conceal the true nature of preparations in the north. Second, suggest that an attack was being mounted in the south. Third, given that all of the preparations in the north could probably not be hidden indefinitely, minimise their apparent scale. Fourth, slow down the apparent rate of the build-up so that when everything was ready, the enemy would think that he still had at least 2 or 3 days before the attack could be launched. Lastly, ideally the attack would be believed to be coming 2 weeks later. Op Bertram consisted of 7 sub-operations, all orchestrated to create a unified picture, show what needed to be shown, hide what needed to be hidden, so that Rommel would believe that the main effort was going to come from the south. Probably the most important operation was Operation Martello, and its intent was to conceal the 10th Corps supplies and equipment build-up. If Rommel was to learn of the build-up of supplies in the north, it would signal where the main effort was coming from. The desert, having no foliage, would mean that something would need to be seen. The question was what? Luckily, A-Force had a very experienced camoufleur, Lieutenant Colonel Barkus, and he'd been working on camouflage plans for over 2 years. The South African contingent included a company of camouflage operators. These would be put to good use. Barkus came up with the plan of not hiding them, but making them look like something else, and in this case it was going to be trucks. He was going to use a device called a Sunshield. Now, and this goes back to how Wavell inculcated a culture of deception. This was actually one of Wavell's original ideas, was a mechanism for making a tank look like a truck. A Sunshield could be used 2 ways. It could make a truck look like a tank, creating the illusion of strength, or it could make a tank look like a truck, hiding that strength. Where the build-up of 10th Corps equipment was to occur, A-Force had a massive truck park developed. The Germans saw the build-up of trucks. They saw that nothing actually occurred from it. It wasn't part of a build-up for an operation, so they became less concerned about a large number of trucks parked in an area. Martello consisted of 3 versions of vehicles. 700 empty sunshades, which could look like trucks and were waiting for tanks that would be eventually occupy the space underneath them. Secondly, boxes of the real supplies, mostly food needed for the attack, which would be stacked in the shape of trucks or under the side tents where the crew were meant to sleep. And real trucks, which were used for the main attack and the crews that would provide activity in the area. The only supplies not covered by this scheme was the fuel for the 10th Corps needed. These would be deposited in slit trenches, which would be unobservable from the air, and there was a significant number of slit trenches already in the Alamein area. Reconnaissance aircraft? These slit trenches were viewed from reconnaissance aircraft, and the Allies were able to hide 2,000 tonnes of fuel in plain sight in these slit trenches. Sub-Operation Cannibal did the same thing except for the guns and the gun tractors, or the so-called quad truck. These were very distinctive and required something a little bit more complicated than the Sunshield. Cannibal split the gun and the limber from the quad and put them both under covers that made them look like trucks. Now, definitely check out the show notes because I've got lots of pictures that describe how all of this fit together, and I've also got a couple of maps that show where these deception operations were conducted. The guns were actually moved into position a month before Operation Lightfoot would commence. 360 guns. They remained there, no activity, and this encouraged the Germans to decrease their vigilance. In a similar but more complicated vein was Sub-Operation Munasib. The camoufleurs created 3 regiments of dummy gun positions in the south. However, dummy positions require maintenance, and these positions didn't get that maintenance. So eventually, over time, the Germans were able to see that these were dummy positions. But Munasib was a double cross, designed for use when the actual attack came. Once the attack started in the north, the gunners replaced the dummy guns with real ones and made the Germans think that the dummy gun position had been created to conceal a main attack in the south. The impression of a logistics build-up in the south was supported by sub-operations Diamond and Bryan. Diamond was a fake water pipeline. Workers would dig 5 miles of trenches each day and install a pipeline which was made from discarded fuel cans. They would be put inside the trench. At night, those same crews would dig up the trench, dig up the fuel cans, and replace the dirt, and then move 5 miles further down the pipeline. The illusion was supported with the development of dummy pumping station and reservoirs, and it was not only designed to create the impression that the main effort was to come from the south with the build-up of water supplies there, but also the time. the rate of advance of the pipeline would not be completed until the beginning of November. Bryan was the reverse of Martello, and it saw the development of fake supply dumps which were capable of holding 7,000 notional tonnes of supplies in the south. Operation Lightfoot would commence on the 23rd of October, but initial moves for the deception plan had commenced weeks prior, with the creation of the fake truck parks. However, the British would commence their final shell game in the days just prior to the 23rd of October. 10th Corps tanks, which had previously moved into assembly areas in the south, and these movements had occurred during the day so that they would be seen by the Germans, moved during the night to occupy empty Sunshields in Martello. As each tank left its position, it was replaced by a dummy tank. Tank tracks were cleared, and as they moved into Martello, each tank occupied its designated Sunshield. Canwell was a radio deception plan that simulated the entire communications net of the 10th Armoured Division. 25 radio transmitters were used to simulate the radio traffic of 8th Army headquarters, the headquarters of a corps and 2 divisions and 5 brigades. On the 23rd of October, 30th and 10th Corps commenced Operation Lightfoot. The battle would continue until 11th of November and set in train a withdrawal for the Panzerarmee Afrika all the way to the Tunisian border. The 5th Panzer Army would be landed to support operations following the torch landings. 5th Panzer would join with Panzerarmee Afrika to create Army Group Afrika. This would surrender on the 13th of May 1943 and would see 230,000 prisoners taken. How can we assess the success of Op Bertram then? Firstly, there was no positive identification of the main effort. The Panzerarmee Afrika report of the 10th of October states, "The British may launch an offensive soon. Panzer Army thinks that the main weight of the enemy attack will be south of Rouissat, the centre of the 30-mile line, and perhaps also on either side of the coast road." A follow-on report on the 16th of October defined the dates of the attack to 20 to 25th of October. While the Germans seem to have identified the British when, they appear to have been unsure of where the main attack would fall, and they indicate the south but perhaps the north. This inability to accurately identify the British main effort is reinforced by their continued separation of their counter-attack forces in the north and south. It isn't clear how certain they were of the timing of the attack, however, because one critical component of it was that Rommel wasn't in the AO. He had been receiving treatment for a medical condition, and it wasn't until the night of the 25th that he returned back to take command. There were also negative reports by German reconnaissance. So the report of the 10th of October shed some light onto the German reconnaissance posture. As assembly of the attacking troops and artillery will take at least 1 or 2 days, our own troops cannot be taken by surprise provided they keep their eyes open and make use of every means of observation. However, the Germans never reported the specific indicator they were looking for. Panzerarmee Afrika's 23rd of October report to their higher headquarters stated, "Enemy situation unchanged." Colonel Richardson was pleased that intercepts from the Luftwaffe in the week prior to Lightfoot all stated nothing to report. The Desert Air Force's remarkable feat of not allowing even one German reconnaissance flight to penetrate 8th Army sectors after the 18th of October prevented the collection of accurate aerial intelligence and served to enhance the ruse. Lastly, and most importantly, there is the delayed movement of the Afrika Korps. While few PAA officers admitted that they'd been deceived by the British deception effort, one notable exception was General von Thoma, the commander of the Afrika Korps at the time of the battle. Upon capture, he stated that German reconnaissance had failed to notice any changes in the 8th Army's posture in the weeks prior to the battle. He was of the opinion that the main effort would come in the south, even after Lightfoot began. This thought is reinforced by the fact that the 21st Panzer Division did not move north until the 26th of October. This would indicate that even Rommel was not convinced of the actual main effort until 4 days after it began. In the next episode, we'll look at just how difficult that fighting on that northern axis, the Allied main effort, was. And if the 21st Panzer had been committed earlier, or indeed had been positioned there prior to the commencement of Lightfoot, We can imagine how much more difficult that fight would have been, and potentially the inability of the 8th Army to achieve the breakout. Added to this is the reinforcements that didn't come, the ones that were tied down in places like Crete. Two things for me that led to the success of Op Bertram and Op Treatment in supporting Op Lightfoot. Firstly, the resources that were allocated to it. 360 Cannibals were created to hide 25-pounders. Almost 1,000 Sunshades were created to either hide or show tanks or trucks based on the operational plan. This is a significant amount of resources, and part of it was due to Colonel Clarke's ability to reach into 8th Army headquarters and get the resources that he needed. On top of that, there was years of deception planning experience based on the efforts of Wavell to create that deception capability within the Western Desert Force. Lastly, there is the integration between operational planning and deception planning. Treatment and Lightfoot weren't tacked on as an afterthought after the plans team had come up with Operation Lightfoot. Operation Lightfoot was created in conjunction with the development of the deception plan. This was really important because there wasn't a lot of room for more traditional deception methods to be used. I'll finish off now with Barton Whaley's process for deception. This is his 10-point plan for the creation of a deception plan. 1. In planning a deception, the planner must know its strategic goal. For the magician, this is always simply to provide the audience with a pleasing and surprising effect or puzzle, for that is all they expect if he is to earn his keep. For the military commander, it may be to launch a surprise invasion of another country, effect a landing on an enemy beach with minimal initial opposition, get the jump on the enemy with a new attack or counterattack, or simply get a reconnaissance or rescue party in and out of hostile territory with sufficiently low casualties to assure success. These goals pose the kind of problems that planners initially face. They are the givens he must work within. 2. The planner must decide how he wants his target to react to such a given situation. The magician requires only that his audience concentrate their attention and interest on the portrayed effect to the exclusion of the secret method. For the military deception planner, however, the problem is more subtle. He then alludes to Dudley Clarke's experience, where he focused on what he wanted the enemy to think, not what he wanted the enemy to do. 3. Only then must the planner, by himself, whether general or magician, decide what he wants the target to think about the facts or event, precisely what it is they should perceive. 4. He must decide specifically what is to be hidden about those facts or impending events and what is to be shown in their stead. In doing this, he should remember the caveat that hiding and showing ideally take place simultaneously, as any deviation from simultaneity gives the target more time to discover the switch. In military practice, hiding usually takes place prior to showing, only sometimes simultaneously, and fortunately rarely afterwards because of the extreme risk. 5. The planner now analyses the pattern of the real things to be hidden so as to identify its distinguishing characteristics, specifically which of these characteristics must be deleted or added in order to give another pattern that suitable masks, repackages, or dazzles. 6. He does the same for the false things to be shown to give another pattern that plausibly mimics, invents, or decoys. 7. At this point, the planner has designed a desired effect together with its hidden method. He must now explore the means available for presenting this effect to the target. The magician may be limited by the type of apparatus he has at hand, his ability to purchase or construct appropriate new apparatus, or the theatrical ability. Military commanders or practitioners of intelligence may be limited by their available deception assets and will often have too little time to acquire additional ones. They must make do or go back to stage 4 planning and try for an alternative design. 8. Having the effect and the means, the planning phase has ended and the operational phase begins. In magic, the planner is usually also the performer. In the military and intelligence fields, the deception planner usually hands over the plan of execution to operational units to present or sell the effect. 9. The channels through which the false characteristics and patterns are communicated must be ones open, directly or indirectly, to the target's senses. A magician should not use a false count or clicking coins before a deaf spectator. An intelligence officer should not plant disinformation in a newspaper unless he has reason to believe the enemy monitors that paper. 10. In order for the deception to succeed, the target must accept or buy the effect. Deception will fail at this point only if the target takes no notice of the presented effect, notices but judges it irrelevant, misconstrues its intended meaning, or detects its method. Conversely, the target will take notice if the effect is designed to attract his attention, find it relevant if the effect can hold his interest, form the intended hypothesis about its meaning if the projected pattern of characteristics is congruent with patterns that are already part of his experience and memory, and fail to detect the deceptions if none of the ever-present characteristics that are incongruent are accessible to his senses. Effective deception planning must anticipate all 4 of these contingencies, and a wise deceiver will seek feedback, monitoring the target's responses to assure that these 4 contingencies are being met. I think Whaley's 10-step process provides a simple step-by-step guide to enable practitioners to be able to come up with workable deception plans. Critically, deception planning doesn't occur in a vacuum. It must be part of the operation, and it also needs information about the target audience, and that is usually the enemy commander. Hopefully you'll have gotten a few ideas out of it. If you're interested in deception, then definitely have a look at Barton Whaley's book. It does have a whole series of 80 case studies in there. There's lots of ones that we haven't looked at that are really interesting as well. We also really haven't touched on the British double-cross system, the use of turned spies. There's a large number of factors that does go into successful deception planning, and we've only really scratched the surface. So have a look at the references. I'll put them up on the show notes. And if you're interested, go and have a look at them. And what I'll try and do is, as we look at other operations, other battles, we'll try and pull out the deception campaigns that we see there as well and analyse them against that 10-step process. Next week, we will continue on with our look at the Second Battle of El Alamein.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.